November 11, 2012. A man is found dead in his home in Belize, a single bullet through the back of his head. Execution style. Within hours, police name their prime suspect, John McAfee, the millionaire who built the antivirus software protecting nearly half the world's computers. By the time officers arrive to question him, he's already gone. What follows will force 3 countries to issue warrants, pull in Interpol, and deploy international resources, all to catch one 70-year-old tech founder who refuses to be captured. He will fake medical emergencies, slip across borders, and vanish again and again, making entire governments look powerless. How does one man stay free that long? And what happens when the chase finally ends? Before John McAfee became a fugitive, before police helicopters and international warrants, he was something else entirely, a solution. In the late 1980s, personal computers were spreading into offices and homes, and with them came a new, invisible threat. Early computer viruses moved quietly, copied through floppy disks, corrupting files, crashing systems, and leaving companies panicked and exposed. Most people didn't understand what was happening, only that their machines could suddenly fail. John McAfee did. He wrote a simple detection program that could identify and isolate these threats. To businesses facing an unfamiliar danger, that mattered. His software didn't just promise protection, it offered clarity in a moment of confusion. And that trust wasn't blind. Companies tested it. IT managers relied on it. Within a few years, major corporations were paying for McAfee's product because it worked. But McAfee's real skill went beyond code. He understood fear, how uncertainty spreads faster than facts, and how institutions respond when they feel outmatched. In interviews, he warned that computer viruses could cripple entire companies, even bring organizations to the brink of collapse. The warnings sounded extreme, but the threat was real enough to make them believable. So when McAfee positioned himself as the man who could hold that chaos back, people listened. Not because they were naive, but because, at the time, he was right. And that early success would plant a dangerous idea in McAfee's mind. That systems could always be predicted. That fear could always be controlled. And that he, more than anyone else, understood how power actually worked. The first real warning sign didn't come from the law. It came from a decision John McAfee made when he still had options. By 2008, the financial crisis had erased most of his fortune. His net worth collapsed from 9 figures to just a few $1 million, not enough to ruin him, but enough to change how he saw the world. Where others saw market failure, McAfee saw confirmation. To him, the crash proved that governments and financial institutions weren't safeguards. They were traps designed to drain independence from individuals who trusted them. At that moment, he could have rebuilt quietly. He still had money, name recognition, and legal advisors. Many people in his position do exactly that. But McAfee didn't retreat. He doubled down. He stopped filing tax returns. He spoke openly about refusing to pay the IRS. He began framing the state not as an authority, but as an enemy. These weren't private thoughts, they were public declarations. And they carried consequences he chose not to engage with. Then came the pivotal move. In 2009, McAfee left the United States for Belize. The choice sounded reasonable on the surface. No extradition treaty. Minimal regulation. A place where a wealthy foreigner could live freely, without interference. To McAfee, it wasn't running, it was opting out. That was the red flag. Not the relocation itself, but the logic behind it. Instead of resolving conflict within the system, he removed himself from it entirely, assuming distance meant safety. Belize didn't feel like hiding, it felt like control. And for a while, it worked. Which is what made the warning easy to ignore. What most people never knew, what never made it into interviews or headlines, was that John McAfee didn't just distrust governments. He believed he could outmaneuver them indefinitely. By the time he settled into Belize, McAfee was no longer behaving like a man seeking privacy. He was operating like someone preparing for conflict. He hired armed bodyguards. He surrounded himself with ex-convicts and loyalists paid in cash. He built compounds, not homes. Surveillance cameras, tripwires, weapons. These weren't precautions for isolation. They were measures for resistance. To the outside world, McAfee was framed as an eccentric expatriate. A wealthy tech founder experimenting with jungle medicine, throwing strange parties, living loudly but harmlessly. Even the Belizean authorities initially treated him that way, unusual but not dangerous. That was the deception. Behind the image of freedom was a growing belief that laws didn't apply to him, and that any government interference was proof of corruption, not oversight. When the gang suppression unit raided his compound in April 2012, killing one of his dogs, seizing weapons, finding no drugs, McAfee didn't interpret it as enforcement or investigation. He took it as confirmation. From that moment on, every action by the state was recast in his mind as an assassination attempt. He slept with a Glock under his pillow. He spoke obsessively about plots, about police working with cartels, about being silenced. And instead of de-escalating, he fortified. The quiet truth is this. The danger wasn't that McAfee was being hunted. It was that he had already decided he was. After the raid, something subtle but dangerous took hold. John McAfee stopped thinking in terms of laws and started thinking in terms of defense. Imagine a man who once locked his front door at night and then decides the door itself is the threat. So he adds more locks, then cameras, then alarms, then guards. Each step feels reasonable on its own. Together, they create a house no one can safely approach, including the people meant to help. That's what McAfee built around himself in Belize. He slept with a gun under his pillow. He surrounded his property with wires that would trip alarms if someone crossed them. He watched camera feeds constantly. He believed danger was always seconds away, so every movement had to be controlled. In his mind, this wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. At the same time, a smaller, quieter conflict was growing just outside his gate. Gregory Fall lived nearby. He didn't want control or confrontation. He wanted peace. Instead, he got barking dogs roaming the beach at night, frightening tourists and biting passers-by. He complained to local officials. He tried to resolve it directly. He warned McAfee that if the situation didn't change, he would act. From McAfee's perspective, the dogs were not pets. They were walls. They made him feel safe. Giving them up felt like tearing holes in his defenses. So neither man backed down. This is where inevitability creeps in. When one person is building higher walls and the other is trying to lower the noise, there is no shared language anymore. Every complaint sounds like an attack. Every warning feels like a threat. By then, the system wasn't broken. It was being quietly ignored, one decision at a time, until only conflict remained. The breaking point didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded through two very different reactions to the same moment. On the night of November 9, 2012, John McAfee's dogs began collapsing. One by one, they foamed at the mouth, convulsed, and died. Someone had poisoned them. To McAfee, this wasn't vandalism or cruelty, it was a message. A warning that his defenses had been breached. His response was immediate and emotional. He ordered his staff to shoot the remaining animals to end their suffering. He paced the compound with a pistol, furious and convinced that someone nearby had crossed an invisible line. But not everyone was reacting from fear. Gregory Fall's world moved differently. He had spent weeks trying to solve a problem through complaints, conversations, and official channels. From his perspective, the situation was spiraling, but it was still a dispute. Noisy dogs, threats, frustration. Problems to be discovered, documented, and resolved. These two mindsets never met. One side was now searching for an enemy. The other still believed this was a conflict that could be exposed and stopped. 24 hours after the poisoning, a single gunshot cracked through the night on Ambergris Cay. It sounded unimportant. A firecracker. A car backfiring. The next morning, Gregory Fall was found dead on his villa floor. A bullet through the back of his head. His laptop and phone gone. At that moment, the roles were set, even if no one realized it yet. By the time anyone could intervene, the moment had already passed. Late morning, November 11th, 2012. Belize police arrive at John McAfee's compound to question him about Gregory Fall's death. They expect an argument. Maybe resistance. Maybe confusion. Instead, they find silence. The gate is open. The house is empty. No staff. No girlfriend. No signs of a hurried escape, just absence. McAfee didn't leave when police knocked. He left before they moved. Hours earlier, while Fall's body was still being processed, McAfee had already grabbed Samantha, abandoned the compound, and vanished into the interior. Not by accident. Not in panic. This was the execution of a plan he had been preparing for months. By the time officers realized he was gone, it was too late to contain anything. Roadblocks came up after the fact. Helicopters were launched into empty sky. The search began in the wrong direction, on the wrong timeline. In that instant, the situation stopped being an investigation. It became a manhunt. And from that point forward, nothing was fully in anyone's control. Not the police, not the government, and not even John McAfee himself. For the people closest to him, the fallout wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, tense, and exhausting. Samantha moved when John told her to move. She didn't know destinations in advance. She didn't ask how long they would stay. Within hours of going underground, they were sleeping in unfamiliar rooms, abandoned buildings, borrowed houses, places where the lights stayed off and conversations stayed low. Every knock, every engine sound outside, carried weight. John, meanwhile, was working through a network he had already built. Safe houses in the interior. Locals who wouldn't talk. Cash moving hand to hand. Within 6 hours of disappearing, he was already rotating locations, staying just ahead of police sweeps that came too late. As the days passed, the search widened. Police dogs moved through jungle paths. Helicopters circled coastal roads. Roadblocks went up across Belize. Anyone known to have contact with McAfee was questioned. Homes were searched. Phones were checked. What began as a homicide inquiry expanded into a national operation. 3 days after the murder, the pressure reached a breaking point. John knew staying in Belize meant capture. Under cover of darkness, he boarded a fishing boat on the southern coast and paid cash for an illegal crossing. No passport. No records. Just open water and silence. By early morning, he stepped onto a deserted Guatemalan beach. By sunrise, he was in Guatemala City, checking into a hotel under a false name. For John, it felt like escape. For the authorities, it marked something else entirely. The moment the case stopped being local and became international. When John McAfee was finally caught in Guatemala, it looked, briefly, like the system had worked. He was arrested in a hotel lobby. Cameras flashed. Officials announced he would be deported back to Belize within 48 hours. On paper, the process was straightforward. Illegal entry meant removal. Belize had a warrant. The chain of accountability appeared intact. But systems don't move like people do. Inside detention, McAfee understood something most people never have to learn. Institutions are designed to protect themselves first. Not truth. Not closure. Stability. And stability depends on avoiding embarrassment, liability, and international incidents. When he collapsed in his cell the next day, clutching his chest, guards panicked. An ambulance was called. Doctors were involved. The story spread instantly. A high-profile American detainee was reportedly suffering heart attacks in custody. Suddenly, the cost of moving him became higher than the cost of delaying. No one wanted to be responsible if he died during deportation. Doctors later found no heart damage, no lasting medical emergency. But by then, the pause had done its work. Lawyers filed appeals. Paperwork stalled. Jurisdictional questions surfaced. Belize wanted him. Guatemala didn't want the risk. And the United States, his country of origin, became the easiest solution. So while agencies adjusted and procedures bent, the outcome shifted. McAfee wasn't sent back to face questioning over a neighbor's death. He was placed on a plane to Miami and released. The institutions survived the moment intact. The people affected by what came before did not. What happened in Guatemala wasn't an exception. It was a template. Once John McAfee realized that visibility could be used as leverage, he stopped trying to disappear. He started performing. Public appearances, viral videos, presidential announcements, each one served the same function. The more unpredictable he became, the harder it was for institutions to respond cleanly. This wasn't about brilliance. It was about pressure. Large systems depend on routine. They expect cooperation, paperwork, predictability. When someone refuses all three and replaces them with noise, speed, and publicity, the system slows itself down trying to contain the risk. McAfee leaned into that weakness. When federal tax charges were secretly filed in 2019, he didn't wait to negotiate. He left. Not through airports or borders, but by sea. A moving target with no fixed address. Each new country introduced new rules, new authorities, new reasons for delay. And every delay bought time. Authorities across different nations didn't fail because they were incompetent. They failed because they were fragmented. No single agency owned the problem long enough to resolve it. Responsibility passed from one jurisdiction to another, while McAfee stayed in motion. This is the part that matters beyond this case. The same mechanics appear whenever enforcement is split across borders, whenever accountability requires coordination instead of action. The person who keeps moving isn't always the smartest, just the one most willing to exploit the gaps. John McAfee didn't create those gaps. He just kept stepping through them. When John McAfee finally stopped running, it wasn't because the system caught up to him. It was because motion had run out. In October 2020, a routine passport scan at a Spanish airport flagged his name. No chase. No spectacle. Just a quiet arrest at the request of the United States. Months later, after 8 months in a concrete cell, a Spanish court approved his extradition. The charges waiting for him were severe: tax evasion, fraud, decades in prison. On June 23, 2021, hours after being told he would be sent back to the U.S., John McAfee was found dead in his cell. Authorities ruled it a suicide. His supporters disagreed. Investigations confirmed the cause. The arguments never stopped. But the larger question lingers, unresolved. If a system can be avoided for years, crossed by yachts and borders and legal delays, is it actually strong? Or just patient? And if John McAfee wasn't the last person to find those gaps, who's using them right now, quietly, while no one's looking? Because the next story doesn't start with a man on the run. It starts with a system that still hasn't learned.